A brass shell rolled across the ground, its sharp clang echoing through the misty dawn. Rodriguez, a young seal, barked, "Don't touch that!" But Sarah bent down, flicked the safety, and pulled back the bolt. Movements so precise that the entire range froze. No one knew she carried her father's legacy, the man once called the breath, because true worth isn't written on the surface, but forged within. If you've ever been misjudged, share your story with Humankind Stories. Subscribe, share, so this flame never fades. Morning at the Oceanside Range began like any other. Cold, damp, and still carrying the faint scent of spent gunpowder clinging to the earth. Rusted steel fences cut shadows into the fog, while the steady rhythm of waves crashing in the distance reminded everyone they were on a soldier's shore. For the SEALs, this was a crucible of discipline. For Sarah, it was simply a part-time job, a modest way to balance nursing school with survival. Her work held no glory, replacing targets, resetting frames, collecting shells, taping holes in paper. The routine wore into her palms until they hardened, her thin jacket forever tinged with the scent of oil and gun smoke. SEALs often strode past without so much as a glance. At best, Sarah was invisible. At worst, a silent joke. The target girl, but in her silence, something stirred. She was always watching. When shooters pressed their shoulders into the ground, she studied posture, breath, and gaze. When bullets cracked through the air, she tracked the dust that rose, the inch-wide differences that told a whole story. No instructor taught her this. These were lessons inherited, etched into memory by her father, Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, once known by comrades as the Breath, a sniper who read the wind like scripture. Yet Sarah never stepped across the painted line. Her past kept her there, haunted by one failed shot in a high school competition, drowned in laughter and words that cut. Girls don't belong behind a rifle. That wound taught her to stay hidden, to carry her father's legacy like a secret she was too afraid to claim. That morning, the SEALs arrived earlier than usual. Among them was Rodriguez, young, restless, cocksure. He settled into position, his rifle an extension of his ego. But when the trigger snapped, the shot tore wide, missing the target by a hand's breadth. Another shot, further off. A third, worse still. The damp air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder as frustration boiled in his face. Rodriguez slammed the rifle against the concrete with a metallic crack that startled even the gulls above. "This rifle's busted!" he spat, voice cutting across the range. A few heads turned, brows raised, but no one challenged him. Sarah stood a few paces back, a paper target in her hand. Her eyes followed his movements, his quivering elbow, ragged breathing, the overstrained stare in his eyes. She knew instantly. It wasn't the rifle. But what right did she have to say it? Jake Sullivan, their team leader, stood further back, silent and composed. He had heard the old stories whispered by veterans, the legend of Gunny Martinez, the sniper called the Breath. And when he watched Sarah, her quiet precision in resetting targets, her instinctive, flawless movements, he wondered if echoes of that legacy still lived. Rodriguez turned, his frustration spilling into mockery. His smirk twisted as he flung the words, "You think you know something? Then step up. Show us." The words pierced the air like a challenge no one expected. Sarah froze, dragged back into the memory of laughter, of failure. The target in her hand trembled as fear gripped her chest. She wanted to retreat, fade into the shadows again, but Jake moved forward. He bent, picked up the rifle, checked the safety, and extended it toward her. His voice was steady, stripped of mockery. "Prove it." The range went still. 8 pairs of eyes locked on her, the girl they dismissed as the target girl. At that moment, Sarah's ordinary world began to fracture. Sarah stood motionless. The rifle lay heavy in her grip, as though it carried the weight of every buried memory at once. The morning wind salted her skin, but her palms were slick with sweat. Beyond the fence, 8 pairs of eyes bore down, half mocking, half curious. In that silence, her past resurfaced. She remembered the one time she had been allowed to fire in school, an all-boys shooting contest. She begged for her chance, but when her shot fell short, the laughter was louder than the crack of the rifle. What do girls know about guns? The words carved themselves into her pride, sharp as knives. From that day on, she vowed never to stand beneath such judgment again. And yet, here she was. Sarah raised the rifle, her movements hesitant, stiff. She lay prone, the stock pressed awkwardly against her shoulder. Her breathing quickened, and beads of sweat stung her brow. Her finger brushed the trigger but froze, locked in doubt. Jake Sullivan said nothing. He stood behind her with quiet composure, eyes sharp but calm, as though his silence alone whispered, "It's just you and the target. Nothing else." Sarah peered through the scope. The target at the end of the range blurred, framed in a halo of mist. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Then her father's voice returned. Gunny Martinez, his hand firm on her back during those dawn lessons, whispering, "You don't shoot for the world. You shoot for the stillness in your own heart." The words steadied her. Sarah drew a long breath, held it, and released it slowly. Her body eased, the tremor fading from her hands. Her finger settled into the trigger's curve and squeezed gently. The crack of the shot split the morning, echoing against steel and sea. Smoke curled upward, carried by the wind. Downrange, a puff of dust leapt almost at the bullseye, less than half an inch away. The range fell silent. 8 pairs of eyes widened at once. The girl dismissed as the outsider had nearly struck a perfect shot on her first shot. Rodriguez clenched his jaw, his face darkening. A few teammates raised their brows, exchanging looks, but no one spoke. Doubt had fractured the certainty in their stares. Jake inclined his head slightly. Not praise, not surprise, but acknowledgement. For Sarah, that simple gesture weighed heavily than applause. She didn't smile. Relief swirled with unease. One shot had proved something, but not enough. The stain of doubt still lingered in their eyes. From the corner, Commander Harrison approached. He said nothing, offered only a cold glance before turning away. But Sarah understood. His silence was not dismissal. It was a warning. Her test had yet to come. The ocean breeze swept across the range again. Sarah lowered the rifle, her hands steadier now. In her chest, her heart still pounded. But this time, it beat with defiance, with the quiet resolve of someone who had stood, at last, before her fear. The target bore its mark at the far end, just a faint puff of dust. Small, but enough to begin another story. That afternoon, the Oceanside Range returned to its usual clamor. Shots cracked one after another, gunsmoke mingling with the salt of the sea. But for Sarah, everything felt different. Eyes no longer drifted past her indifferently. They lingered, watching, scrutinizing, half curious, half doubtful. Some whispered that the morning shot had been pure luck. Suspicion crept into every side comment, every smirk tinged with condescension. To men who had spent their lives on the firing line, the target girl could never truly match their skill. Sarah remained silent. She kept gathering brass, replacing targets, adjusting frames. Yet her hands trembled more than usual. Inside her, a storm wrestled. Should she step forward or retreat again? Memories from her youth returned, haunting like shadows. The laughter that stabbed when she failed her first high school shoot. Her father's stern yet gentle face, Gunny Martinez, repeating one truth. You don't need applause, only to do what's right. But she had turned away from that, hiding in menial work, too afraid of the world's gaze. Jake Sullivan watched from a distance. He didn't say much, but his steady attention was enough to unsettle Rodriguez. The young SEAL began sowing doubt, muttering that Sarah's shot was just a fluke, that another round would expose her. His words spread quickly, carried like sea wind across the sand. Night fell. Sarah sat alone in the small room behind the target shed, under the faint glow of a yellow lamp. The metal box her father had left behind was on the worn wooden table. Inside, among mementos, was a faded photograph. Her father in uniform, eyes calm and steady. Beside him, in scrawled handwriting, steady breath, steady eyes, steady hands. She touched the photo, then clenched it in her palm. The fear of failure pressed in again. Yet with it, a small ember of fire began to stir. Could she bear the weight of that legacy? Or would she forever remain at the margins? Outside, heavy footsteps echoed. Rodriguez passed by, glancing into the dim room with a smirk. He said nothing. His eyes alone planted more doubt. Sarah lowered her head, chest tightening. She longed to prove herself, yet the fear of collapse still gripped her lungs, and so the struggle inside her grew more tense, between a legacy worth carrying and a wound that had never healed. The next morning, Oceanside Range seemed clothed in a different light. Sunbeams cut through the fog, casting long streaks across gray sand, while the distant surf blended with the metallic clack of rifle stocks hitting the ground. Sarah stood outside the fence, still in her plain uniform. She did not enter the formation, only watched quietly. But her very presence made heads turn. Some eyes carried unease, others challenge. Jake Sullivan, the team leader, motioned for her to come closer. He didn't speak much. He simply set a rifle on the table and gave a slight nod. A nod that was both an invitation and a test. Sarah swallowed hard. Her breath quickened, palms damp, but this time she didn't back away. She stepped over the chalk line, where Rodriguez and several teammates waited. Their stares seemed intent on tearing through her fragile shell. Rodriguez smirked, voice dripping with scorn. Not luck this time, right? Prove it. Sarah gave no reply. She lay down at the firing line, body aligned to the ground. Left hand braced the forend. Right hand rested on the trigger, her finger poised delicately as though afraid to shatter something fragile. The range hushed. Even the waves seemed distant. Only the pounding of her heartbeat filled her ears. She recalled her father's words. Steady breath, steady eyes, steady hands. She inhaled deeply, held it, released slowly, then pulled the trigger. The sharp crack tore through the silence. A fine burst of dust rose at the bullseye's center. The crowd froze. Rodriguez's eyes darkened. Sarah followed with a second round, then a third. Each bullet tore into the target's heart. Holes clustered so tightly they nearly touched. Smoke curled upward, caught in sunlight, shimmering like silver threads. Silence. Then a few gasps slipped out. Jake didn't hide the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He knew this was no accident. This was skill, hidden, disciplined, inherited. Rodriguez turned away, his jaw tight. But Sarah noticed his hand clench into a fist. She felt no triumph, no urge to gloat. Rising, She laid the rifle gently back on the table, then stepped aside with quiet restraint. From afar, Harrison, the senior officer, had been watching. He approached now, eyes stern yet inquisitive. His voice broke the silence. "Where did you learn?" Sarah lowered her gaze, answering simply, "From my father." A sea breeze swept across the range, carrying a heavy silence. And in that stillness, the soldiers around her began to realize. The man once nicknamed the Breath lived on in this girl. That moment marked her crossing. No longer the invisible target girl. She was now the bearer of a legacy, even if she did not know how far she could carry it. From that day forward, every look cast her way changed. No longer indifferent, but filled with curiosity, challenge, and the beginnings of respect. A week later, the Oceanside Range came alive again. But this time, Sarah was no longer standing outside the fence. She had been invited to join a trial training session with the SEAL Group under Harrison's direct order. The name The Breath, inherited from her father, had sparked their inescapable curiosity. But curiosity did not mean trust. Rodriguez stepped up before the training began. He folded his arms, a half smile tugging at his lips. "This isn't a game. Let's see how long you last." Sarah gave no reply, only a nod. She knew today was not just another shooting test. It was a full-scale trial, with 8 men's eyes watching her every move. The first exercise, shooting under pressure. Each trainee had to sprint 200 meters, dive across sand, and hit 3 consecutive targets at 500 yards. Sarah drew a deep breath and launched forward. The ocean wind whipped against her face, sand clung to her skin, and sweat beaded along her temples. When she reached her position, she dropped to the ground, the rifle weighing heavily in her arms. Her heartbeat pounded like war drums. Through the scope, the target blurred in the salt haze. She inhaled, held her breath steady, and squeezed the trigger. The first round struck the edge of the bullseye. The second pierced the center. The third veered slightly, but still landed within the scoring ring. A few eyes widened in surprise. No one could deny she had passed. But Rodriguez only shook his head and muttered, "Barely enough. Out there, barely means dead." The second exercise, adjusting for a teammate. Jake brought a young recruit into position. The boy's hands trembled, and his first shot went wide by nearly a yard. Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Breathe deep. Don't rush the trigger. Feel your heartbeat. Wait until it softens." She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder and adjusted his elbow slightly. The second shot. The bullet flew straight into the black ring. The young soldier stared at her, stunned, his eyes glowing with gratitude. Jake pressed his lips together, giving the slightest nod. Harrison jotted notes in his book, but Rodriguez turned away sharply, as if conceding a silent defeat. When training ended, Harrison approached. He handed Sarah a sealed envelope. "Nah, join us. Become an official training assistant." A moment many dreamed of was suddenly in her hands. But her heart grew heavy. She looked at the paper. It felt like a mountain on her chest. Memories surged. Her father teaching her, never forcing, never pressuring, only patient guidance and a gaze full of trust. She knew that here, everything would be bound in iron discipline. She would have to obey orders instead of teaching in her way. Sarah shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, I can't." Silence fell, heavy and unmoving. Rodriguez sneered, taking it as a private victory. But Jake and Harrison watched her differently, not with disappointment, but with a need to understand. Sarah lowered her head, then walked away. Her steps were light yet firm. She didn't need a title to prove herself. She only knew her path did not lie on a podium of honor, but in places where someone needed a steady hand to rise again. And from that moment of refusal, Her true journey had only just begun. Sarah left the Oceanside Range that day feeling lighter, yet carrying a vast emptiness inside. She had turned down an offer many would dream of, to become a SEAL training assistant. But to her, value was not in titles, but in preserving her father's legacy. The old warehouse behind a seaside street became her starting point. Its tin roof was rusted, wooden doors groaned with every push, but to Sarah, it was an empty canvas large enough to plant the seed of a dream. She spent the first days cleaning it herself, sweeping cobwebs, brushing off dust, patching holes in the walls. A few old wooden targets were donated by one of her father's former comrades, now a local gun shop owner. A gunny would want his daughter to carry on, he said simply. With the savings from 8 months of working at the range, Sarah bought a few training rifles and cheap scopes. They weren't as modern as the SEAL's gear, but they were enough to teach what her father had emphasized: breath control, patience, and respect for every shot. On the first day of opening, only 3 students showed up. A young man who had dropped out of police training after missing too many shots. A middle-aged firefighter, his calloused hands trembling as he held a rifle. And a young woman who had quit her job after male colleagues dismissed her. They stood before Sarah, their eyes a mix of doubt and hope. She smiled gently and invited them to sit on the dusty cement floor. Here, we don't need titles, we don't need badges. All we need is to breathe, to see, and to believe that we can. The first lesson was not about pulling the trigger, it was about breathing. Sarah led them outside, asking them to close their eyes and place their hands on their chests. Then inhale for 5 seconds, hold for 3, exhale slowly, repeat. Let your body guide you, not your fear. Breath by breath, their rhythm steadied, and in the silence, waves carried back like a distant drumbeat. After that, she taught them to read the wind by watching reeds sway, to hear the metallic ring when a rifle stock touched the ground, to practice patience, wait until the mind is ready before letting the bullet fly. Weeks passed, and her small class, Precision for Life, began to draw more students. Rumors spread. There was a girl teaching shooting unlike anywhere else. No yelling, no scolding, only patience and uncanny precision. One afternoon, Sarah adjusted the stance of the firefighter. His hands shook, his eyes red. My partner once died in a blaze because I missed a shot at the gas tank, he whispered. Sarah rested a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing. She only guided his breath again. His next bullet struck the bullseye. The man collapsed to his knees, covering his face, weeping. Sarah did not need his thanks. She only felt a salty drop run from her eye, unsure if it came from the sea breeze or her heart. There were hard days, too. Some students quit, calling the breathing drills meaningless. But Sarah never wavered. She remembered her father's words. Teaching someone to pull a trigger is easy. Teaching them patience is hard. But once they learn it, they will carry it for life. The old warehouse slowly transformed into something unique. Not a harsh training ground, not merely a classroom, but a place where the fallen came to find trust again. In guiding them, Sarah also found her path, one not drawn by others, but deeply meaningful in its quiet way. One summer morning, Sarah received a special letter when the Precision for Life class had nearly 20 students. A navy blue seal, signed by none other than Commander Harrison. In the letter, he invited her and her students to the Oceanside training field to participate in a live combat coordination drill. Not to be tested, but to be witnessed, he wrote briefly. That day, the training ground was packed. Not only soldiers, but the entire community around the base had gathered. Loudspeakers echoed. The crash of waves mingled with the thumping rotors of helicopters in the distance. Sarah and her students walked in, under curious, doubtful stares. Rodriguez stood with arms crossed, eyes sharp with challenge. But Jake smiled faintly, as if welcoming something he knew would unfold. The scenario: rescue of civilians trapped in an area with concealed snipers. The SEALs would take on direct assault, while Sarah's class, those who had never been official soldiers, would support, observe, and adjust. The sea winds were powerful that day. The sun scorched, grains of sand stinging eyes. Mock targets stood scattered on the hillside. When the signal whistle blew, everything burst into motion. Rodriguez led the charge. Blank rounds roared. Troops advanced, but the targets were distant and visibility was obstructed. At that moment, Sarah and her students were called into position. A young SEAL recruit missed shot after shot. The blank fire flew wild, failing to suppress the targets. For a few seconds, the scenario nearly collapsed into chaos. Harrison turned, eyes severe. Sarah stepped forward. She signaled the recruit to hold his breath, then gently adjusted the angle of his scope. "Wait. At the moment the wind stills," she whispered. The recruit squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack. The target fell instantly. The entire training ground froze for a heartbeat. Then, one after another, Sarah's students worked alongside the SEALs. They didn't fire in their place. They guided, the breathing, the angle, the patience. Every shot a SEAL took carried an invisible mark of precision for life. For the first time, Rodriguez was struck silent. He watched those he had once mocked, amateurs in his eyes, become the support the elite team leaned on. When the final target dropped, the whistle of completion sounded. Cheers erupted from the stands. Families, townspeople, and old veterans stood and applauded. Harrison stepped into the center. His voice carried over the loudspeaker. "Today, we witnessed more than skill. We witnessed a legacy, values from the past, alive in the present." All eyes turned to Sarah. She didn't raise her rifle, didn't bask in the glory. She simply laid a hand over her chest and bowed her head, and then something unexpected happened. Rodriguez, the loudest doubter, slowly stepped forward. He stood tall, snapped his boots together, and gave Sarah a formal military salute. The training ground fell utterly silent, before exploding in applause that would not end. No one saw Sarah as merely the sniper's daughter anymore. She had become a bridge between past and present, between soldiers and civilians. The community had witnessed, and in their hearts, something shifted. Not because bullets hit targets, but because a legacy had been passed on. That afternoon, Oceanside Training Ground slowly emptied. The noise faded, leaving only the sea wind and a few figures gathering the shattered targets. But inside everyone, the echoes of the morning still lingered. Sarah didn't leave right away. She stood at the far end of the bleachers, where her father once sat, her gaze distant. She opened the old notebook in her hands. Its cover cracked, pages yellowed. Gunny Martinez's scrawled words are still alive. Patience, breath, heart first. One student approached, the female firefighter whom her colleagues had once mocked. She held a small pistol, her hands still trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice unsteady, but her eyes shining. "Today was the first time I believed I could." Sarah smiled, closed the notebook, and placed it in her hands. "It isn't mine," she said softly. "It's a legacy. Keep it, and pass it on when you meet someone who needs it." The young woman clutched the notebook, tears glistening. It was no longer just worn paper and ink, but a bridge between generations. Elsewhere, Rodriguez sat quietly. He looked down at his hands, then back at Sarah. In his eyes, no arrogance remained, only the silence of a man who had just learned a profound lesson. He spoke no apology, but his action said it all. The next morning, he walked into Precision for Life as a new student. Harrison, the stern commander, had also changed. Instead of an official summons, he sent Sarah a small envelope. Inside was not an order, but a pass granting her access to the training field anytime. No rank, no title. The door is always open to you. Sarah read it and smiled. She knew her path was not in titles, but in passing things on. In the days that followed, Sarah's class grew unique. Not only SEAL recruits, but ordinary townsfolk came. An old veteran with lingering wounds, a policewoman wanting sharper composure, a young man who once feared firearms. They didn't come to be snipers, but to learn patience, breathing, and belief in themselves. Sarah didn't preach, didn't speak of glory. She only did what her father had once done, laid a gentle hand on a student's shoulder, adjusted their stance, and reminded them, breathe deep, aim with the heart. One sunset, after class ended, Sarah sat alone looking at the sea. The horizon glowed red with the last light of day, the wind carrying the ocean's salt. Inside, a strange peace settled. She understood. Not everyone needs to be praised or named. Some legacies must be quietly safeguarded, passed hand to hand, eye to eye. Sarah's story, from a girl dismissed on the training field to the keeper of memory and guide for others, had outgrown the bullets. It had become a story of faith, of old values reborn in a new generation.